I'm going to ask Joe and John to come join me up front if they would. Get you to sit over here, John. It is my privilege and delight to introduce these two esteemed gentlemen here. They have blessed us with their presence this day, and they come from different perspectives, and yet also ones that intersect and intertwine. And so to my right here is Joe Brewer, and Joe is... Joe is part of the Regenerate Cascadia conference and movement that's hosted by the Department of the Bioregion based in Seattle, and is a co-founder of the Design School in Regenerating the Earth. He also wants you to know that he's a human being who walks on the earth and wants humans to have a future on the earth. To my left is John Burrows, who is Anishinaabe from the Great Lakes region, but has been in this part of the world for the last 23 years, teaching at first UBC and then at UVic in the Faculty of Law. Those of you who have been following the developments at places like UVic know that we're one of the first institutions in Canada to have an Indigenous law school, and that's thanks to the work of John. And so currently he's on leave and seconded by the University of Toronto and doing the same thing there. And so we're delighted to have him here. He also serves as the chair of the Multi-Faith Society here in Victoria and is a practicing Christian in the Latter-day Saints tradition. And so welcome, John, and welcome, Joe. We're glad to have you with us this day. You heard in our opening scripture a passage that is probably familiar to you. But what might not have been familiar to you is the translation from which Mingu read this day. It comes from the Inclusive Bible version. And I think it reflects an important transformation and a re-look at our own history. The passage that perhaps many of you grew up with in the Revised Standard Version or maybe the King James Version would have said that God created the earth and gave it to the human beings to have dominion over it. You'll note that in this translation, it's stewardship. That's a shift. It's a shift for us in our progressive theological lens to realize that to have dominion or power over anyone or anything is never a healthy relationship. That instead, God invites us into a sense of relationship. And that's what it means to be co-creators with God. The passage ends with the notion of Sabbath, or time of rest, a time for regenerating our own souls and of the earth. And as we move in through the weeks, you're going to hear more about that sense of Sabbath and rest as it relates to the earth and our economics. And the notion that as part of that Sabbath, there's also a cycle that in every 7 years, there's fallow and time of rest for the earth. And then on the 50th year, after 7 cycles of the 7, there's a Jubilee year in which the land and its belongings and its boundaries are returned back to its original place, a time of fallow. It's out of this tradition that we, in a sense, have the foundations of what we're going to talk about this morning. And so I'm going to get Joe to start, and I'm going to ask you, Joe, if you'd begin by defining this term bioregionalism and why this paradigm is different from perhaps other approaches to environmentalism.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you, John. And thank you all for making time for us this morning. I want to share this idea of bioregionalism through the lens of the human capacity to live within delusion and the ability to believe that we're separated even when it's not true. And I think many of us, probably many of us here, have had the feeling of not knowing where we belong, not knowing who are our people, and not knowing where is home. And so one of the things I want to begin with in talking about this idea of a bioregion is that most of our environmental discourse pretends, falsely, that the problem is somewhere outside of ourselves. Like that river has a problem because it's contaminated, so therefore I must fix that thing outside of myself. When actually, the core of all of our environmental challenges come from the human relationship to whatever. The human relationship to ourselves, to our community, to land, to that river. And so bioregionalism, which started in the 1960s and 1970s as a back to the land movement and as a protest against the dominant globalizing system and its political corruption, is one lens through which bioregionalism has been understood. And it's an interesting and worthwhile history. But there's another lens that I think lends more strength of a clear foundation, which is that a bioregion is a biological region, or said another way, it is the geographic range in which the whole life context can exist for any living being. So if we put this in the context of humans, for there to be a human culture and a human community, they must have a geographic range in which to meet all of their material needs, to cultivate and strengthen their spiritual connections, and also to have a place to belong. And so bioregion is the scale at which a life system flourishes in a holistic way. Now, being here on Vancouver Island, you are already part of a bioregional movement that goes back at least as early as the 1970s. And the name given to that movement is Cascadia. It's got a complex history. And one of the key elements of Cascadia as a movement has been to discover its roots to living in place. So the bioregionalism perspective helps us see that we cannot live without healthy rivers, healthy forests, in a place like this in the Salish Sea, healthy marine life, healthy weather systems, and that we are part of this as a sense of belonging. So I really want to emphasize this element that to be bioregional is to return to the state of grace of being a human being as part of the earth embedded in place.
Thanks, Joe. So, John, from your perspective then, what does the indigenous wisdom and knowledge and bioregionalism intersect in terms of faith, spirituality, all those kind of pieces?
Yeah, well, one of the things I appreciate with indigenous spirituality is the varieties of it. There's so many different nations and languages and relationships to territory, and those give us different angles of vision and perspectives on how we might live in relationship to one another, to the great spiritual mysteries that surround us, as well as the particularities of the earth that we find ourselves a part of. And so whether it's clans and being literal, I'm Otter clan, and so my ancestors are Otter, and there's responsibilities and relationships with Otter, and I have others in my family that may be Bear or Loon or Pike, etc. And so the sense is that we are the earth, we are those beings, and they are us. And that's our view from an Anishinaabe perspective. When I was learning with Saanich law, the first ancestors here is the rain. And the relationship that we have to the rain is where we come from. And when I put those different teachings across so many nations together, there's this sense of us being in the earth and of the earth and connected to a greater spirituality that tries to understand the gifts that are a part of that and the responsibilities that are a part of that to ensure that those cycles of life continue.
So we're at some interesting intersections in life. We know that within this concept of bioregionalism, that there are a sense of some limits to the capacity for sustainable human growth. So what happens when we hit those limits? What do we do? How does that get managed?
Yeah, those limits are teachers to us that allow us to see what we should not be going beyond. They become the opportunity to respond and understand, again, our responsibilities in those things. I think that those limits can be freeing. Sometimes we think about limits as being constraining, but in fact, if I want to be free to play the piano, I have to understand the limits that are a part of that, the discipline, the patterns, the practice that would enable me at times then to be able to be free to practice that beautiful instrumentation. And so it is with the limits on our ways of living in relationship to the earth and to one another. That becomes the practices of freedom. We are then truly free if we're living in a place that recognizes those bounds.
Want to talk to that same question?
Yeah, I wanted to bring in an ecological lens on how all living beings live as part of a continual cycle of life. And those of us who might have learned about the work of Charles Darwin and the theory of natural selection and how evolution plays out, we might have heard the emphasis on how life, it develops through the ability to have reproductive success, that we can produce viable offspring. But there's another side of that story, which is for there to be viable offspring, there actually needs to be aging, and there needs to be death, and there needs to be decay. Because without that other half of the life cycle, that there will not be any space. You would overpopulate the space, there'd be no resources left, and there wouldn't be the capacity to have viable offspring. So the other half of this life pattern is to select for a healthy death, to have the composting and the cycling of nutrients. And this takes on a really powerful ecological dimension, which is that there is a carrying capacity. There are limits to which any organism or part of an ecosystem can dominate or bring imbalance to the overall life system without causing the entire thing to collapse. But then when we move over to a spiritual lens, we see a very deep lesson, which is that if we accept the concept of immortality as if there's life without limits, then we lose the ability to see each moment as precious. Whereas when we recognize, and I think this relates very well to what John was saying about the limits actually reveal what is gained, is that by seeing that we are part of a life flow where we receive the gifts of life, and then we have a responsibility with gratitude to return them, including the minerals and the water that make up my body that are of the earth. I will gift them back to the earth. That we discover the ability to hold as sacred every moment that we're given as a celebration of life. And I think this is especially important through the lens of this question of belonging. Because one of the most valuable gifts that we can give is our passion and our creativity and our love during life, and then to choose where to place our bones as a gift back to the land, as a way of honoring and thanking the land for the life that we received. And so I see this connection with limits as being a cultivation of the sanctity of death to restore the preciousness of life.
Limits are a challenging thing for us in our human beings. We have this sense of exponential growth. We have this sense that there are not limits to those kind of things. But what each of you is saying is that there are limits. And so how, from both the micro and the macro place, do we begin to both acknowledge those limits but also live into them? What are some of those practical applications of the ways in which we do and deal with those limits?
I really appreciate many traditions that teach us about those practical applications, and I appreciate what we have cited to us today with the Sabbaths and the Jubilees, which are these times of rest and reflection and not always taking, but recognizing the importance of a regeneration that occurs in that way. And when those laws were being given, there was fields that were left at the edges for people to glean, that not everything was private property, that there was a public dimension to accessing what the beauty and grace and bounty of the earth is. Those are practical things. In my tradition, in my community, we don't use the same rivers, the same areas to pull out the fish or to pull out our nourishment from with the hunting that we do. We allow things to be for times and have that fallow practice. And so those are practical things that come from this tradition that I also find resonance in an indigenous practice as well. I also really appreciate what Jesus taught in analogizing our behavior to the natural world around us and seeing the natural world around us as being our teachers, our professors, the archive of knowledge that's in the earth. He said, consider the lilies of the field, how they toil not, neither do they spin. Or he compared faith to a mustard seed, or putting seed in different grounds. He said, I am the vine and you are the branches. Right? We are connected in those ways. The practicality of the tradition teaches us of our connectivity and our need to celebrate that with one another. The communion is a radical plant ceremony. Why is it a plant ceremony? Because we crush that grain, we take it into our body, and we're remembering that we're connected to the earth and we're connected to the creator of this earth. And then we take that grape and we crush that grape and we take that into ourselves, reminding ourselves that we are part of that vine and branch. And what did Jesus do to choose to teach us about who he is and what our relationship is? The earth. And when we participate in that radical communion, celebrating together our connectivity to the earth, that is called a covenant. The covenant and the treaty that we have with all living beings, and that covenant and treaty that we have with our Creator is a practical way of continuing to replicate those responsibilities.
Thanks, John.
I wanted to build upon what John was saying about allowing the land to regenerate, which is that in these times where we have degraded and destroyed so many ecological functions, that actually there are tipping points beyond which they don't regenerate themselves anymore. A great example is the desertification, where you've cut down the forest and you've broken the water cycle, and the process of drying and heating continues. And without active human intervention, we don't restore the ability for the land to heal itself. And so there's this place of understanding how that regeneration occurs, which is that there is a natural dynamic to any living system where the patterns themselves reproduce the conditions of life. The movement of water, the movement and cycling of nutrients. For example, when I become hungry, my body seeks food. And then as I bring food into my body, it restores the nutrients that my body needs to be alive. And there's this regeneration, this living pattern. And so one of the practical things that I see for how we work within limits is to recognize that one of the limits we're working within is self-imposed, which is we have diminished or lowered, we've reduced the size for the limits of what life can give on our land. And that by working with the living processes of the land, we can increase it. Like yesterday, I was with the Friends of Bowker Creek as they showed us the possibilities of daylighting and of restoring connectivity and restoring integration of water and land, and then also reconnecting the fragmented community through all of the absurd lines, just like on that globe that you were showing the children, that divide and break apart this naturally occurring watershed. That there's more life there if the harmony is restored to how life works, which is to say, to connect the life patterns. And so the piece of practical advice that I would give would be to organize around land. to look at and learn from and recognize how land already organizes itself. And Bowker Creek, by the way, will be a wonderful teacher for you. 8 kilometers in horizontal distance, spanning 3 municipalities, and many other details I'm just learning about. It's a very complex situation. But there's a moraine at the top where the ice sheets themselves prepared the gravel and the sand to absorb water. And then there's a natural pattern of flow for wetlands and grasslands and forest. And there used to be salmon in that stream. And you can feel the land is shaped to have more life than it has now. And so as you organize around land, you find the ability to increase those limits within the bounds of what life is capable of. And you find that life is capable of more than we realized by celebrating the regeneration of regeneration, or the restoration of life patterns embedded in a place.
So let's draw our time together, building on what you've just said. What gives you hope for the future?
Well, actually, I'm really content at this stage in my life to not have hope, because I've looked into the face of the world and I see the darkness. And instead I've found devotion. Devotion being the place where I do what is right, whether or not I get to the outcome that I seek. This is what causes a person to plant the seeds of a tree whose shade they will never sit under. And so for me, I found my place of hope in devotion, in deep connection with life. And I've also found that everywhere I go, there are people who are acting in service to life. And this gives me the joy and the peace in my heart to continue.
Todd?
The hope I find is found in love, the love that we receive from God as we participate in creation and are able to pass that along to those that we in turn love. I was at home on the reserve a few weeks ago with Queen's Law students and University of Toronto Law students. My daughter's a professor at Queen's Law School. I'm a professor at University of Toronto Law School. We had all those students there. There was my mother, myself, my daughter, and my grandchildren, Wasea and Akika. Wasea means shining bright and clear. Akika means the fullness of the earth. There we were in 4 generations with all of these students. The love was flowing towards the earth, and I'm appreciative of the love that we have in our traditions and in our relationships to really give us hope, to ensure that we continue to pass these precious, precious gifts along.
Thank you both. This is but a small bit of the conversation. And we hope that you will continue it over soup today. The question of the day, of course, is where is the intersection for you of spirituality and care for the earth? And following the soup time and the conversation and stuff that we'll have, for those of you who want to push a little bit deeper, you're invited to stay a little bit longer. The Regenerating Cascadia folks are also hosting some roundtable conversations. In that same space, you don't have to go very far. You'll have been nurtured. You can have a bathroom break and then stay if you would like for those conversations as well. So thank you to each of you for your participation in the hope for and the relational connections for this planet and our future. Thanks be to God.